In any player versus player game, there will be a moment where it's either impossible for you to win or impossible for you to lose. Think of a game with a strict time limit like basketball. If your team is down by 50 points and there are 5 minutes left in the game, then there isn't really a way for you to win. If your team is down by 8 points and there are 10 seconds left in the game, then there's also pretty much no way for you to win. If this moment where winning is impossible happens too early in the game, then it can be a major source of frustration. If I think that a match is impossible to win, and I have to keep playing for another half an hour, then it feels like the game's wasting my time, and I'm probably not going to play it again. I'm disengaged because it feels like my actions will no longer affect the outcome of the game. This applies to a lesser degree in matches that are impossible to lose. If I decisively beat someone half an hour ago, and the game is still going, then I end up feeling a lot less engaged than if I'd played a nail-biter of a match where no one knew who was going to win until the very end. In that ideal match, players stay engaged because the allure of winning or the threat of losing is always within arm's reach. The possibility of a comeback is thrilling, but this can also be mishandled. If you're winning for almost the entire game, but someone swoops in and steals your victory at the very end, it can feel like everything that happened before didn't actually matter. How a game enables or limits losing players to make a comeback is what I refer to as volatility. If you're designing a player versus player game, then you have to think about how your mechanics increase or decrease volatility. If a game is not volatile enough, then the entire match is decided by what happens in the very beginning. If a game is too volatile, then the entire match is decided by what happens at the very end. I can't tell you how volatile your game should be, but I can tell you how different mechanics across different games influence volatility. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be talking exclusively about player versus player games. Co-op games and single-player games are interesting topics for volatility, but this video is already large enough, and so I'm trying to keep my scope limited. If you want to talk about that in the comments, please do so. I think it's a really interesting topic. The most obvious example of a mechanic that decreases volatility is a mechanic that allows players to snowball. These are mechanics where doing well early in a game gives you some sort of bonus that makes it easier to continue winning. In a MOBA like League of Legends, killing enemy players gives you money and experience points. That money and experience makes you stronger, which makes it easier to kill more players in the future. At a certain point, one team can be so far ahead on money, XP, and map objectives that the other team can't really do anything.
But bro, if Akali takes kills, I can't do anything! What? I'm better than that guy, please watch replay on stream.
I think that this lack of volatility is why League is one of the few video games that allows a team to concede partway through a match. If you truly think that the game is hopeless, then you don't have to continue playing. This is of course a bit tricky, because how hopeless the situation actually is based on people's perceptions rather than the reality of the game. If you've been playing League for years, then you've probably conceded games that you could have won, but you never know that you could have won those games. If you never conceded a game in League, would those comebacks have been worth the far greater number of games where your team got beaten to a pulp? Another mechanic that limits volatility is when games end at a time or turn limit. If the game is close, then it'll be tense even with these limits in place. However, as the game approaches the time limit, it often becomes mathematically impossible for certain players to win. The basketball hypothetical I used at the beginning of the video is an example of this. If games were played to a point limit instead of a time limit, then it would always be possible for the losing team to make a comeback. Time and turn limits exist for several reasons, a big one being scheduling. If you're playing pickup basketball at the rec center, you don't need a timer. But if you're running a basketball league that schedules multiple games a day on the same court, then setting a time limit allows you to manage that much more smoothly. Volleyball is actually played to a point limit instead of a time limit, and I'm not entirely sure how volleyball leagues handle that. If you've played volleyball in leagues and have insight into this, please let me know in the comments. When talking about time limits, it's also worth mentioning that they can be their own point system. Take Overwatch and Team Fortress 2 as examples. Both of these games have game modes where one team is trying to complete an objective in a certain amount of time, and the other team is trying to prevent the first team from completing that objective in the time limit. Both of these games use an overtime system to allow the attacking team to make a comeback from a situation that would otherwise be mathematically impossible to win. The way the overtime system works is that if an attacker is actively completing an objective when the timer runs out, then the game goes into overtime and continues until the attackers are either removed from the objective or when the objective is fully completed. This leads to exciting moments where attackers are trying to hold on to an objective while desperately fending off defenders. The best example of a comeback mechanic that increases volatility is any sort of catch-up mechanic that penalizes players who are doing well or rewards players who are doing poorly. Mario Kart's items are a great example of this. The items that you get in Mario Kart get better and better the further behind you are in the race. Not only that, most of them affect players in front of you and not players behind you. Randomness is another common way to increase volatility. When Magic the Gathering was being first developed, Richard Garfield knew that players would occasionally lose games because bad luck meant that they never drew the lands they needed. Infamously, he decided to keep this as a game mechanic because he wanted even the best decks to have a chance to fail against weaker decks. One thing worth mentioning when discussing volatility is pace of play. If you increase the speed at which players have to make decisions, you increase the likelihood of strategic blunders, potentially ones where a winning player throws away their lead. This sort of increases volatility, but you also have to consider that strong players are less likely to make these sorts of mistakes. Strong players are also more likely to get ahead in the first place. This is, by definition, what makes them strong players. So, some mechanics increase volatility and others decrease it. But games have systems where mechanics that increase volatility and decrease volatility are joined together. Look at Counter-Strike, for example. Getting kills and winning rounds in Counter-Strike earns you money to buy better equipment. This allows teams to snowball since the better equipment makes it easier to get future kills and win future rounds. At the same time, the amount of money you get from killing someone depends on what weapon you use, with cheaper weapons giving you more money than more expensive ones. Additionally, you lose all the equipment that you've bought when you die, allowing players on the other team to pick it up. Players on your team can also pick it up, but in terms of your gun, your most expensive piece of equipment, this might not be helpful. If you and your teammate spend the same amount of money on your weapons, then your teammate probably doesn't get a benefit from picking it up, whereas an enemy who spent much less on their weapon probably would. When you put all this together, you get a system where the poorer team is at a disadvantage, but they're heavily rewarded if they manage to win a round anyways. Another great example is Overwatch. Again, playing well in Overwatch allows you to charge your ultimate ability faster, meaning that you get to use it more often throughout a match. This gives you a significant advantage over all the teamfights of a match. At the same time, ultimates are a resource that you spend to win those teamfights. If a team wins a teamfight by spending several ultimates, then they'll be at a disadvantage in the next teamfight because those ultimates won't have recharged yet. I can't tell you how volatile your game should be. That's something that ultimately comes down to personal preference and what exact mechanics are affecting volatility. That said, I think that one flavor of volatility that tends to make games better is allowing and rewarding big, exciting plays. I know that I've already used a million different games as examples, but let's talk about chess. If you've played a single chess game, you know that queens are disproportionately powerful pieces. So powerful, in fact, that taking the opponent's queen while maintaining your own can turn a losing game into a winning one. Doing this is very difficult, but the possibility of doing it and reversing the momentum of a match means that winning players have to stay engaged even when they're far ahead of their opponent. Additionally, chess's design means that a person who gets their queen taken has no one to blame but themselves. Chess is not a very volatile game. Taking pieces allows you to snowball over your opponent. But if it didn't have queens, then comebacks would be less frequent and less glamorous. Queens weren't always this powerful, but the excitement they added to the game allowed, quote, Mad Queen's chess to spread throughout Europe as other versions of chess faded into irrelevancy. Anyone who follows the channel knows that I'm working on my own board game called Musketeers. This possibility of making big plays is how I address volatility in my game. Players can shift the momentum of the match through highly damaging and very expensive attacks, such as Decisive Strike and Mortal Blow. Using these attacks is a big risk, but if you land them, the amount of damage that they do absolutely will swing a match in your favor. Thank you for watching. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on game design, click the video on the left. And if you want to learn more about my game, click the video on the right.